So.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
So that's us. We don't even have to pay attention to that necessarily. But.
Okay.
All right. Anyway, so I'm here with Greg Whitworth. He is what, a program manager or a POM? What do they call you?
Yeah, program manager on web platform team for Microsoft Edge. So the rendering engine, specifically primarily like layout CSS space. That's kind of where I work.
So yeah, I think he's the CSS guy. You also are involved in the standards that define what CSS is.
Yeah. To some extent, we have a few folks, Francois, Melanie, Rosin, from our team that work on the standards body. Yeah, for CSS.
So for people who don't know how CSS is made, like the sausage essentially in the standards, what can you kind of wrap it up in a nutshell? What kind of goes on?
Yeah, it's basically we kind of watch what web developers are doing, trends that they're working on, and kind of pain points, if you will, for lack of a better term, and try to start tackling those in ways that are not only possible and also allow the web to still work, but are also performant and I wouldn't say necessarily easy to implement, but easy to maintain and like make logical sense, because there's a lot of things that web developers want to do, and like we would love to make everything just happen, but there's architectures that we have to take into consideration, and like all that wonderful maintenance of software that we have to consider as well.
So obviously a big thing for y'all right now is that CSS Grid has dropped not only with y'all but basically everybody else.
Yeah.
But it really started here.
To some extent, yeah. I mean, there's it's like it would be disingenuous to say it completely started here.
But wasn't Internet Explorer the first one to ship a version of CSS Grid?
Yes, of CSS Grid. There's quite a few folks that have had ideas of Grid. Like for example, we had XAML. We have Grid in XAML.
Right. My impression from the outside is that y'all took kind of that spec as the basis to start CSS Grid.
And we did. Basically, the person was working on Silverlight in XAML came over here and basically said, hey, the web doesn't have Grid and it needs Grid. And then we worked a lot with the standards bodies like you were just mentioning, and they said, hey, there's all kinds of like problems with this, it's way too like fixed, and they improved it. And that's the great thing about working with other
that's a good way to say some of my frustration with XAML Grid back in the day too, was something that doesn't feel natural to me for some reason. Yeah,
and so we got a lot of wonderful improvements because the web was already responsive. Like we couldn't just say, oh, we always know we're going to have 3 columns, because we don't.
Right.
We may end up with only 2. And so there's just wonderful feedback. And so, yes, I would say that's where things started to actually gain momentum, because once you get a browser implementation, there have been folks that have wanted grid type layouts prior to Microsoft bringing a proposal. But having proposals is one thing, having actual code shipping is another, because like I was saying, it proves that it can be implemented.
Right.
And so a lot of people like don't necessarily want to do something because they're worried about performance and the maintenance and all that other stuff. So yeah, I would say that's really what got the ball rolling, but there were other people that had ideas.
Now, as far as evangelism to developers, I know Rachel's part of the team, and she's really heavy into it with Jessica Simmons, like being an evangelist of the grid concept.
Oh, okay. I thought you meant our team. I was like,
no. But yes. Developer uptake on this, because it's very new and everything. I think a lot of developers that I've mentioned it to are a little confused about things like, well, Bootstrap's got a grid in it.
Yeah,
and it's not the same kind of thing.
Yeah, no, and just for clarification, it's Jen Simmons. I don't know if you're gonna.
Oh, okay.
It's Jen Simmons, not Jessica Simmons. But yeah, Jen Simmons is a designer advocate for Mozilla. Does a wonderful job. Rachel Andrews, who you mentioned as well, both of them CSS working group members, just did a great job and continue to do a great job on everything layout and design based, getting that information out there to folks, because. And I know both of them have articles about this where, hey, I've been using Grid forever because Bootstrap has a grid. And basically what that is it's using the layout techniques of the time. So floats and grids have been in design. Jen Simmons actually has a talk about this, about how grids have been in design forever, like forever. And so, I mean, you can go into our locker room over there and we have grid paper that you can lay things out on, just sketching it out. And so, yeah, this is an actual paradigm that is true grid. And so, like, rather than using floats and calling it a grid, it's true grid. We're actually slicing up the page in a certain way that you've asked us to, and then you're able to place things within those grid cells.
And it also is differentiated from Flexbox, whereas Flexbox is more, I saw the thing one-dimensional, and I think it's really XY, but Grid's more of a three-dimensional almost.
No. So Flex is definitely one-dimensional, and Grid is two-dimensional.
Well, I think about it as two-dimensional as I can make it go right, or I can make it go. So it is one-dimensional, but I think about it XY.
But, sure. Yeah. But that is definitely why we call it one-dimensional, is because you only have control of that one dimension, and then as the content lays out, similar to how like block layout, you don't necessarily have that same control. So you can control the flexibility in one dimension, whereas Grid, you have the control of the flexibility in two dimensions.
Right.
And that's what really sets Grid apart.
And I kind of, when I say three dimensions, in my brain, I'm thinking kind of almost a time and space adding into that. That's the way I kind of think. That's the way my brain works. So.
Sure. Yeah.
So
no worries.
Anyway.
Yeah.
But I've been using Flexbox a lot, and I'm trying to get my head around Grid. It's one of those things I don't have enough time bandwidth to do what I want to really just sit down and say for a day and get it. But it's slowly happening. I've got a few little starter things I'm working with.
Yeah.
And it's good that I can, I've been using media queries to make it different for different screen sizes and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But there's still, there's a lot to it, and I feel like I'm a little lost at times, and sometimes I'm like, nothing's happening.
Yeah, and I think once it kind of clicks, because Grid, I think the big difference from Grid in comparison to Flex is Grid forces you to think about the grid first rather than the content first.
Right.
At least in my experience, and I'm sure that there's other designers that think about it differently, but that's the bigger paradigm shift. But once I think you get some of those foundations, fundamentals of the grid, once you're off to the races, and you're kind of free.
And they work naturally together too. I think about it almost like a golf club set.
Yeah.
One's the driver to get the whole grid done, but the Flexbox is more up around the green, the pitching and putting.
Yeah, this is Rachel Andrew. Actually, I saw today. I don't know if it's a brand new article, but she was basically talking about CSS Grid 1 year later. And I do think that that's a huge misconception, is people think Grid came out, that means all of their layouts are bad. And each one, like you were just saying with golf clubs, each one has their place. Just like, hey, floating images, using float is still the easiest way to do that, and having inline content wrap around it. Floats are still your best solution to that. But we should have not been using them to create grids.
Right, exactly.
So that's...
We've got a lot of hacks over the years, and we're seeing this is stuff that chisels that away.
Yeah, exactly.
Much cleaner code, much less code.
And then I would say that's primarily been the goal, not only of the CSS working group, but many of the working groups is, hey, and I mean, you can kind of see that with jQuery and ECMA, TC39, like basically stepping in and saying, hey, there's all these things that people are having to work around. Why don't we just adopt those? Right. The web manifesto kind of approach. Yeah.
So another thing that I haven't seen a lot of take up on yet, but I think has got a lot of potential layout coolness, is the shapes. And I'm not talking about like the article I wrote a few days ago about making stars and hearts and stuff, but like making shapes around images. Yeah, to make it look like a magazine layout.
Yeah, CSS shapes. So that's actually an awesome specification. Razan Atanisov, who is our dev lead for layout, actually is one of the spec editors on that. It's one that we definitely have a desire to implement, but it's similar to your point. We haven't seen as much demand nor usage on the web. Right. And that kind of leads into, why haven't we worked on it when we have one of the spec editors? It kind of always boils back to that. Like, we have only so many people, so much time.
I think it's a combination. Most of the web is done by developers we aren't designers. Yeah, okay. And design folks probably don't know about the technical side of it as much. They don't know that it's there.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Although forever they photoshopped, this is what it should look like.
Yeah. So maybe they should start bringing some of those things back to push the developers further.
But y'all, to the point, like, that it's not being implemented a lot. You have something online with the data visualization of what is actually in use. Yeah. Where y'all run it through, like, the data crawled by Bing, effectively, I think is right, and then you essentially do machine learning to figure out what people are actually doing.
Machine learning is giving us too much credit. We don't do that.
Just basic statistical analysis. Yes. Because I've looked at that and I'm like, that's very fascinating that's being used that much and that little, because there was.
Yeah. So we use it primarily. So Shapes is actually a great example, because we actually crawl with every browser, because if Microsoft Edge doesn't support it, we're not going to see it. Right. So we crawl with every browser, and we've actually worked with every other browser out there that they've made fixes so that it works on our crawler. So, like, huge shout out to the other browser vendors. That's great of them to help us to do that. Just so that we can see that data, and it just helps inform. And it's only one data point, because people a lot of times can confuse data and make it say what they want, but it's only one data point that we take into account
Right.
when prioritizing. So.
But I like the fact that you share it publicly.
Yeah.
Because like I hear a lot of noise around something, and I can go look at that and go, yeah, but it's only like 0.5% of the pages.
And that was actually why we made it public, was that we were hoping that people would go to status and then go to this data page, and they would kind of be able to plan for themselves and basically do exactly what you just said, where, oh, well, here's why they're not doing it. And now, am I saying everybody should go out there and make their pages break in Microsoft Edge? No, but I really buy into progressive enhancement. Like, if a browser supports something that you want to use, similar to like when we supported MS Grid back in the days, give that to that browser. Allow the users in that one to have that richer experience, and other browsers take note. I mean, that's just the way it is, and it's something that I didn't know at the time as a web developer prior to coming here, how much power I actually had. Maybe not just Greg out there building a website, but all of us collectively.
So there's a lot of cool things in CSS, and I'm constantly finding ways to do things and just like newness of things. But something that I do like to use that I don't know that a lot of web developers are aware of is like keyframe animations. And those have been around for a while. Yeah. And you can do a lot of really cool subtle things with that. What are some things about maybe keyframes that stick out to you, or like maybe some?
I think the biggest thing that sticks out to me is actually non-CSS developers, primarily JavaScript developers that still do animations on every frame rather than using keyframes in CSS. And it's worth noting you can still use keyframes in JavaScript, because we are able to heavily optimize CSS keyframes. We're able to actually pass those off to the compositor on a different thread and just let that animation play, and that allows like scrolling and everything else that's on the UI thread just be buttery smooth. And so if you have any animations and there is any reason why you're like reaching for JavaScript, I would be shocked if we're not necessarily able to do that in CSS keyframes. I know, for example, like I know some folks push it really to its limits, but that's also where the Web Animations API comes in. And hit us up on user voice. Like that's another one I really look forward to Microsoft Edge supporting. But yeah, it allows us to heavily optimize that, and CSS keyframes is just awesome in my opinion.
Yeah. So the animations in JavaScript has always been something that's bugged me, and I know the background for the most part comes from like jQuery had that built in, especially in jQuery UI to make the growing and stuff like that. But now we got transforms and all that kind of stuff. So we got all kinds of cool ways to do it. But I still see new code where the JavaScript's doing it. And I just
Yeah, I think a lot of people just reach for the thing they know most. They're comfortable with it.
So, but you also talked about I'm a big performance wonk. Everybody knows that. So the layout and compositing, this is still kind of mystery to me a lot of times. And a lot of it's because of the tooling, whether it's you or Chrome or Firefox. I'm not necessarily sure what I'm looking at in the dev tools to find where those bottlenecks are. I mean, I know the big yellow slug means JavaScript, right? But I know there's like purple and green that have to do with the layout and compositing aspects of it. And there's certain, like, I know there's key properties you don't want to like mess with a ton. Like you don't want to animate. Well, I forget what it is. It basically makes you recalc the whole page and stuff like that. Was it Jake Free that Jake put together to kind of identify some of those?
It's basically anything that forces layout. And I actually have a talk on this, and it's on Vimeo. You can find it. It's called Braces to Pixels. And basically it just talks about how your CSS ends up being painted and the invalidations that occur for it. And it basically talks about this, because most of CSS, and this is the thing that like I would say is a pro and a con of CSS, most performance problems from CSS are not just this silver bullet, hey, if I just, like with images, it's like, hey, if I compress this down, look, I saved 400K. Basically CSS is death by 1,000 cuts kind of situation. And so what you end up having to do is find all of those areas where you're touching the box without needing to touch the box. And having us recalc a ton of styles, or hey, audit your styles and find styles that maybe a developer left in there 2 years ago and you no longer need, but we're having to still traverse the tree and say, hey, should these styles apply to these boxes? And it's like, no. And now we have optimizations around that. But every browser is also different in those optimizations.
Now, I can say point blank, like I finally figured out how to drive un-CSS to give me my CSS I'm actually using. And I can tell you that the performance of my pages just shot through the roof. I mean, just big night and day difference instantly.
I would say that is the thing that I'm most excited about with web components, and I understand that that's a little bit down the road for like true support where web developers can just depend on it night and day. All of their users have web components. I understand that. But I would say that's the thing I'm most excited about, because on CSS, while it's great, like you hopefully have a very static page. Because most of those aren't actually spinning up a browser and then going and saying, hey, was this hovered?
Exactly.
And so like technically it'll come back and say, hey, this hover thing wasn't used, and it's kind of like, well, it's because you didn't hover the mouse button, you know? And that's similar to Chrome's audits and F12 in their dev tools. While they're cool, like it's very similar thing, and that's why I'm excited about.
As long as you know where the limitations are, you can, like I think you can add like don't take this class out, don't take this rule out, and stuff like that.
Well, and then that's and I think basically web developers have been fighting against this problem. That's where like BIM and all this, you know, object-oriented CSS comes into play, because it just kind of helps you fight that problem of basically CSS is right in the middle, and so like it's tying all these different things together. So how do you truly audit what is and isn't used? And I think web components will hopefully at some point help us solve that problem.
I haven't had a chance to really dig into web components enough. One of the reasons is I know that there's a lot of hesitation to get it implemented. So I'll have to look into that, but it does make sense because you really compartmentalize.
Yeah, it's just a single thing. So like when you like pull that button out, the style should come with that button.
Right.
And so your CSS is, we're no longer like calculating styles for something that no longer exists.
My bigger concern is that now it's going to mean I'm going to have even more CSS going down and it's effectively duplicated amongst them. I don't know, because I don't know exactly how it's going to work out.
Sure. I mean, I don't think you'll ever, like even in C++ or C# an object-oriented programming language, you still have to, you know, have style guides and make sure your developers are adhering to, hey, if these files are no longer being used, these are dead class.
I know what happens, especially in enterprise. Developer A comes in and he uses vendor X's component library, and then he leaves, and the next guy comes in and he wants vendor Y, and then they just both get dropped in there. But there's a lot of overlap in the styles. So that's why I see a lot of cruft kind of building up that's essentially duplicated.
Definitely. And basically what I usually say is, if you have no auditing being done at all, try at least just starting twice a year. Just to go through and at least understand all the CSS that you have, especially on a team, because it can quickly just add up, because you have a fire, you know, this day, and so you just throw in a class to solve the problem, and then, you know, another fire, but maybe somebody rewrote that, and that fire is, you know, gone. And
standard life in the developer.
Well, exactly, and it's so easy, I think, as browser vendors to like forget that at times, but like that is reality. So, you know, that's the world I came from, where it's like, we need to sign up this weekend. We don't care about anything else. Just get it up.
So without actually looking at the developer tools, what can I look at in the performance tab that's going to clue me into like some CSS issues that maybe I can look at and address?
So I would say the biggest one, the hurdle is, first of all, like calculating styles. So similar to you looking and seeing that big yellow slug, I think the colors are different in every browser dev tool, but basically
that's another problem for me.
If you see a lot of like CSS or style calculation occurring, and I actually love, I'm not sure if Chrome's does, I know ours does, it shows you every element underneath. And so if you start seeing, for example, you're recalculating styles on the body a lot, why? Like you actually want to like be very focused. Like you only want invalidating of like
small squares.
Yeah, exactly. You want to be invalidating the smallest amount you can. You don't want to be invalidating the entire body. And a lot of times that actually comes back to JavaScript. The majority of the time, rarely is somebody applying something that's right on the body that CSS is then invalidating. Usually somebody's touching something with JavaScript that is requiring us, like, what is my client distance from this box to another box, and then it's got to go relay out everything to answer that question. So usually it comes back to JavaScript. Another one is if you see a repeating pattern anywhere, I don't even actually care how big the formatting piece, sorry, I'm using internal lingo, but style calculation. So like if you have CSS occurring over and over again and you had like script right before it. And so you see script, CSS, and then layout just over and over again, you see a pattern. It's very, we call it read, write, modify. Usually what that is, hey, how big are you? And then it does layout, and then it's like, oh, I'm 500 pixels. And it's like, sweet, okay, cool. Well, now I'm going to totally replace you, destroy you, throw you away, and insert a new box that's bigger because I want like some type of scenario. But that's a very common pattern.
Mm-hmm.
People do, and sometimes you can't avoid it.
So I'm sitting in my head thinking, what would it be? It's like when I go to the news site and they've got a small space for the ad, and the ad's like this tall.
Yeah.
It shoots everything down, and then I readjust the page, and all of a sudden the ad goes away, and then it shoots back up.
Sure. And another common example, and so this is all, again, very, I have examples of this in that talk, and now they're very egregious examples where they're painfully obvious, but some, I would say, practical, real-life example ones that we have is when people want to do like ellipses. And they do it in JavaScript. And so basically what ends up happening is they check the size of the box. Did we overflow? Yes, okay. Well, now we're going to go in and we're going to cut down the characters. Okay, well, guess what just happened? You're no longer overflowing. So now we have to relay out. And that's a good example of maybe they had no other choice, and the designer, steadfast. And hey, guess what? WebKit line clamp is coming to Edge 17.
I wrote a blog post the other day that included the CSS property to do ellipsis.
Yeah. So that is actually now shipping in Edge, because it's actually a non-standard property, but it's one that's like really popular and solves a very common developer demand that we're trying to standardize.
I didn't know that was there, and I was like really excited to see that.
Yeah, it's a very hacky, weird thing, but it solves the problem, and that's another good example of something we're trying to standardize into something called max lines. That takes away the need for like WebKit box and stuff of that nature. But very exciting that at least that's shipping. It's weird, but goodness, it's needed on the platform.
Yeah, it's going to solve a lot of problems, I think.
Yeah.
Because especially with responsive design, you really have no clue.
Yeah. It's a very common request, and due to all the bugs in WebKit line clamp, we've been very apprehensive to implement it, but we're finally at that point, so it's exciting.
So I'm starting to see style sheets with CSS variables in there, and I'm pretty excited about that because I've been using less, and now everything's kind of seems like everybody's moving to Sass. But if I can just do the variables in the straight CSS, because I'm not a big fan of like pre-compile or transpiling stuff, basically, because I like working in the actual code that's going to be there.
Sure.
So variables are really cool. But maybe people don't know what variables are, and don't know things like Sass and less yet.
Sure.
Can you maybe give us a little summary of what that's going on?
Yeah. So CSS variables, also known as like CSS Custom Properties, they basically what they are. If you never use Sass or less, I'm sure you've probably done some theming on some website at some point. Where, hey, you have primary, secondary colors from some brand, and you have to use that, 70 times throughout the site. And so you just copy those hex colors everywhere. And then the designer comes back and says, you know what, we actually want it just a little bit darker. And so now you have to do the find and replace. And hopefully they want true find and replace. I've had instances before where it's, we only want it actually in the header or these other areas. The beauty of custom properties is you actually now get the capability of basically defining a custom property, which is just -- foo, and then you can give it any string. It actually doesn't matter. You don't have to go into it thinking, hey, I'm going to use this as a background or as a color. You can shove whatever you want in there. But normally it makes sense to think about what you're going to be using it on. So in this case, we could take that primary color and assign it to -- foo, and then anywhere else within the code that we want. So let's say we go color : we go var -- foo. That now references, and that's within the cascade. And I would say the biggest benefit of CSS custom properties over variables in Sass and less is that they're dynamic, because within Sass and less, once you've compiled it, that's its value for good. So if you ever wanted to change colors or something, you would end up needing to just actually change that same hex value or keyword, whatever it is. Whereas this now
completely replace the style sheet altogether. Exactly.
Now you can just actually update that custom property on the fly, and it works.
So I'm pretty excited about that. It's getting pretty broad support by all the mainstream browsers. Yeah.
There's pretty much everybody supports it at this point. We shipped that last release, and it's another good example of something that's just been needed. And it actually, what's interesting about it is how it quickly actually exposed some missing gaps in various browsers where like calc support wasn't necessary, is the wrong word. Wasn't necessarily supported well. We actually did a lot of work in supporting calc within like color modifiers, because quickly we were working on a demo that was using theming.
So you can use calc to change the color?
Yeah, so you can do like RGBA. You could basically take like -- foo +2. Yeah, exactly. And so it allows you to do basically color modification. So you can say, hey, this is red, and then I want to add +2 to it.
So that's pretty cool because I've been trying to use more and more materialized CSS because I like material design.
Sure. Yeah.
And it's got all the mix-in functions, effectively darken -1, -2, lighten, and so.
So if that excites you, you should go look at the new color specification. This is a good example of one where I really, really want it, and they actually have those same methods, light and darken, where it's just doing color math.
Okay.
Where basically, hey, if you do --foo and that's the color red, I actually just want it darkened by 10%. That would be possible. So that's a good example of one. I'm really excited about a future color property. Nobody currently implements it, but it's very exciting because that is so common.
So go vote the user voice up on that one.
Yes.
We'll make a friend.
And everybody, go to Gecko, go to Blink, tell them you want it. I know designers and developers would love it. I just think it's one of those things where not many people have written about it.
Yeah.
Because it's kind of just in the spec, just sitting there. And so it's actually remarkable. Again, I go back, web developers, you have way more power than I think you realize.
Yeah, I mean, we'll go back to keyframes. You can design your own Bezier curve, whatever curve math. If you want to, you can go nuts with that.
Sure.
I don't have time to do that. It's been a long time since I took those math classes, though. But,
and there are a lot of web developers that we get bugs from that do just that. And do remarkable jobs, much better at math than I am. So
it's been a long time since I had to do matrix math, but more power to them. And I love the fact that I can just say Bezier curve and give it. Well, I think there's a function part to it or something. It's been a while since I actually defined it.
I don't have many needs to use Bezier curves in my day to day. But the theming, we actually made a demo. That's it's kind of a silly name, but it's Custom Properties Pooch. So you can look that up on Microsoft Edge. And basically it's a dog sitting in front of a city, and you can make basically the sunset, and everything changes colors, and basically everything gets that cool, and then the sun, everything goes warm, and that's all just through changing variables.
I was actually sitting down thinking about how could I make a weather progressive web app. That would be a
that's a perfect example of just being able to adjust the, basically you're changing the warmth or the coolness of a color. On using calcs within RGBA. Yeah.
All right. So is there any kind of cool CSS feature that you just really get excited about that we haven't talked about?
Oh, goodness gracious. So that we haven't talked about, okay, because I've already talked about a few of them. I get excited for so many of them. I would say one that I'm really interested in trying to solve is, and I still don't actually have a great solution for it besides starting to step into the Houdini stuff.
We didn't even talk about that.
Okay, so is container queries, because I do agree a lot of web developers have a desire for that problem, which is basically...
So is that like a subset of media queries? I don't think I've heard of this yet.
Yeah. Container queries is basically, hey, I actually don't care about the size of my viewport. A perfect example of this is if you ever have used Outlook.
Okay.
And you have your left side column with all your folders. If you drag that window, the icons change, and they maybe show text or something.
Yes.
Now, you've never changed the size of the window within the viewport, but you've changed the size of, essentially, if you were to rebuild that in web terms, that would be a div.
This, yes.
Yeah, and so the problem with it stems from basically it's recursion in a lot of respects, or it's really unperformant. The second, because most people would call it container queries now rather than element queries, because of the fact that, hey, if we put it on the container, we've broken recursion. So we no longer have the recursion problem. The problem is it's really unperformant. So if you take, for example, Grid, and then you have all these auto-based things, it's just very unperformant. It's a very unfortunate thing, but I think that there is a way to solve it. And like I was saying, Houdini is a good example of trying to go after that and solving it in that way.
Because right now, if I did something like just say a dashboard with the left side navigation and icons, the way I've done it in the past is, okay, if I'm at this media query breakpoint for width, then I don't have enough room for the icons, or I don't have enough room for the text, so now the icons show, and I have to do it at the big level and just assume that I have that much space.
So I would say a few things. One is there's actually a feature called Resize Observer. Currently it is only in Chrome. It actually is very similar to a feature that we removed. I can't remember which version we removed it in, but it was actually Element Resize. MS Element Resize. And basically what it does is it fires when that box is resized. And so Resize Observer, the beauty of it is it's asynchronous. And basically it just sets up a queue, a mini task. And so basically what happens is, hey, when that box is resized, you've now registered, hey, I care about this div, and when it gets to the size of 500 pixels, let me know.
Mm-hmm.
And it lets you know at layout time.
It sounds like the match media.
Yeah. Well, it's matched media, except for like it's now in the middle of the pipeline, so it's happening at layout time. And so this is kind of allowing the browsers to kind of give web developers what they want, but somewhat, because basically the argument against Resize Observer is it's in JavaScript, and people want it in CSS. The problem is to answer the question of is it a certain size happens at layout, which is after CSS has occurred.
Okay.
So basically what you know it, like the CSS you're typing. We then go into layout to resolve all these widths. Well, so basically the CSS is the input into layout.
Well, that's a very good, this is some of the inside stuff that I get hanging out with y'all. Well, how do the browsers actually operate? What's the workflow in them? Yeah. And by talking to y'all, I've been able to design my pages to theoretically run better and faster because I understand the process underneath a lot better. Yeah. So that's like, that kind of stuff is very valuable, I think. It's just understanding, well, this is why this doesn't work because CSS has already happened. Yeah, and it's, I totally get the premise, I get the desire. I would say I actually used to be one of the folks that would say, well, this needs to be in CSS. And at some point, I think we'll get around to that. And I guess that's kind of why I keep talking about Houdini, is because at some point you'll have ways of writing your own custom things to teach the parser. Well, what is Houdini?
CSS Houdini.
I know you get excited about it. I've seen some chatter from Mozilla and Chrome.
Yeah, I would say I don't get super excited about it.
Well, I've seen you get excited about it.
I did. There are aspects about it I get excited about. Yeah. Because some of it is just so painfully obvious that it's solving pain points that web developers want. Well,
so give me a definition.
I'll give you an example. Yeah. So the typed-OM is technically in CSS Houdini. Okay. But basically the typed-OM is making it so when you do get computed style and you say, I want to know how big this box is, and it says it's 545 pixels, it tells you that in a string. Mm-hmm. Okay, so thanks get computed style. I appreciate you telling me how big that is, but now I'm in JavaScript. How do I work with that? Right. Okay, well now I need to cut off the PX and then also like wrap it in to convert it to an integer. And the type-to, yeah, exactly. And type-to-OM basically, it's now just an object that web developers are used to, a JSON object, that says, hey, for this CSS property, here's the types that it's going to contain, and we're just going to shove it in this object where you're already going to use it. So you're just going to actually say, hey, element dot, I can't actually remember all the syntax, I'm sure the spec has changed, so it probably actually isn't good to even say what it is, but basically you would be able to say, hey, what is your background color? And it'll say 45, 65, 35, and it'll say, and then there's another item that says unit, and it'll be RGB. And so like, it's already broken up so you can manipulate it and work with it. Okay. Right from there. And that's a good example of, I think some things within CSS Houdini maybe a little bit harder and are maybe a little bit loftier. I think that they're still doable, but they're going to be harder problems for us to solve. Whereas some of these are just things the web platform needs in general. Like they just make APIs that we kind of have right now that are a little bit hokey, just perfect now. Another good example that I was just on Twitter, probably excited about, maybe one that you saw, is the parser API, which is every engine has a CSS parser, and yet so many of us end up writing, like that pixel example I just gave you, writing a subset of the parser so that we can get something out of it. And why not just make it so I can pass you an entire style sheet if I want to, and you return me basically a set of typed-OM objects. And so that's why the reason that one's kind of been delayed is because we're waiting for the typed-OM to kind of flush out. But that's a good example of stuff that's coming out of Houdini that while it may not be solving the initial like true goals of Houdini, which is to allow you to extend CSS, they're great stepping stones to just improving the platform as we know it now. Okay.
So I know another thing that's coming out, was variable fonts or something?
Yeah. So this is actually coming in Edge 17, and so shipping soon. Right. Very exciting. Microsoft has been heavily involved in the OpenType spec. Folks much smarter than me in fonts have been working on this. And we actually have some wonderful fonts already in Windows that are variable fonts. And what it allows you to me, the big takeaway for variable fonts is performance. Right. Basically, we had web fonts come in, and the excitement around them, designers were like, finally, everything I've been doing in print, I can finally do.
And now they throw 50 of them on there.
Exactly. And then the web developers are like, wait a second, why is it taking like 10 seconds for my web page to render? Or the designer saying, yes, it maybe immediately renders in the case of IE because we show it even if the font isn't downloaded. But IE and Edge, sorry, and then it like switches out, you know, and it looks not good.
Or the Falk.
Yeah, exactly.
Falk. I can't
Yeah, no, it's flash event style text. You're correct.
Text, yeah.
And but basically, what variable fonts allows is the font designers now can just have a set of axes. So rather than downloading 50 different fonts, you download that one, and then you're telling that font, hey, the width axis, I want you to stretch to make it so that you're the width, the wider type of text, your bolder text, or hey, I want you the width to be really narrow and be really condensed. And these are all animatable. It's very similar to the variables that we were talking about earlier. So rather than it being separate font files, we're only downloading one.
This would be like segue thin, segue bold.
Yes, all the different instances.
So it's not where I can.
One font.
It's not like with what I've done in the past is with take Fontella, which is a service, and then just take the glyphs out of Font Awesome that I need and put those into a small font of like 12 or something.
And that's probably something you'll still want to do. It's still a good habit to be in. But this would allow, if you end up having, let's say you're using like Segoa everywhere, which currently I don't believe is a variable font.
Okay, I keep calling it Segway.
So hey, like I'm not going to claim I know how to pronounce it the best way. Somebody on the fonts team will have to step in and correct me probably. But but Bond Shrift is one that we do ship in box as of last release. And we've now have the plumbing through to Edge where you can control it with font variation settings within CSS. We also support font optical sizing. Currently Safari is the only other browser that supports that. And what that does is it changes the X height and also makes the strokes thicker so that it's more legible at like smaller font sizes, and it just keeps its design by the font designer correct so it's more legible. And it's just a very exciting time because I think we're going to start getting more of those creative designs that designers have always wanted to do on the web, because now we can potentially download maybe only two font files, but they still have that extreme range of condensed, extra condensed, thin, wide, extra bold, italic, all within, one or two font files rather than needing, 7 to 10. A few of my colleagues and I are actually working on a guide for variable fonts that actually digs into this quite a bit. We should hopefully be shipping it within the next week or two.
Okay.
Pretty exciting. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And it goes through all of these things and shows how like beautiful you can animate these variable fonts, all the different axes. It unleashes a lot of creative capabilities on the web that while we had them before, they weren't performance, and we know performance is money, and so a lot of people cut back on things.
Yeah. So was there anything else like that developers need to be aware of that is emerging?
It's emerging.
Because there's always new stuff. Like I said, I'm constantly finding there's a new thing here.
So have you heard of Intersection Observer?
Oh, I love that.
Okay, yeah.
I've got that on my big to-do list so that I can hide images until I need them.
Yes, so I would say that's one that I don't see used enough yet, and it's a good performance technique. Where, for those of you unaware, basically it allows you to define. You can either by default it will use the viewport, and you can then say, this box, let me know when it intersects the viewport. But you can also define, and this is where I get excited, because I can define my own viewport, so I can make one box of viewports. And I have a CodePen example of this. So before we support a WebKit line clamp, I would use that to basically detect overflow. And this is similar to where I kind of call into question container queries, because a lot of times people say they care about the width, but that's not actually the case. They actually care about overflow.
Okay, yeah.
And so basically you can use Intersection Observer to watch overflow. And so the second that it overflows, that's actually when you want the styles to change. You don't actually just want them always to change based on the size, because you may not be overflowing. You may always want that. You actually don't know if it's 400 pixels or 300 pixels. You don't know that, because a lot of us build sites that are dynamic. So how do you know when you should show the icon and shouldn't? You only care when it overflows. Right. And so I actually have a talk coming up CSS Day in Amsterdam where I get into this, a few different techniques, and that's one of them. It's Intersection Observer, and only firing it when you actually need it, rather than, and that's a good example of, if you set those pixel sizes, you could be recomputing because you're smaller than that width when it actually doesn't change anything to the end user.
Yeah. So, when you any other kind of cool new features that are getting supported across the board. Oh, I see something.
Getting supported across the board. I'm not getting supported across the board.
Well, what's something you think developers need to be aware of?
So shapes, I think, is a good example of one that people need to. I would desire for people to start asking for. Resize Observer is another good example because while I understand it's not in CSS, it solves your container query problem.
Okay.
And I understand it's in JS, and a lot of people really don't want that disconnected, but it solves it in a performant way kind of now. And a lot, I think CSS is actually really in a great position. There's still work to be done, but like with grid shipping, variables, and a lot of the Houdini stuff coming down the pipeline, we just have. I feel like we're in a really good place. Like it's almost like a lot of the things we're wanting is nice to haves, not necessities. I would say like Subgrid for grid is something that I think we need to tackle and figure out when it comes to speccing. I'm not necessarily talking about implementing at this point, but ensuring that the specification.
I'm glad you're saying that because that's something I have sort of thought about. Because I'm like, it'd be nice to define this a little because I think I know what you're talking about. Like in ASP.NET world, like a master page, and then a layout inside of that, and then possibly another layout.
So I'm not a huge ASP.NET user. So sorry to our ASP folks.
Don't worry. We can flesh that out later.
Yeah, sorry. But basically what Subgrid is, hey, I have a grid, and right now the only things that you can place on the grid are its direct children of the grid, thus grid items. And Subgrid says, technically, you may have something that's multiple levels deep that I still want to snap to that grid. Okay. And so that may be what you're referring to, but that's basically what I would say is
just in my mind, I'm thinking of that way.
One of the larger things that I foresee the working group continuing to tackle, because I know there's wonderful folks, the spec editors are already looking into that. Rachel Andrews, Jen Simmons looking at that. Another good example for grid as well, I know Jen Simmons has ideas for styling your grid areas, even though you may not have a grid item to go into that, as well as something region space. That's another one that I would love to see.
Throw a non-breaking space character in there, right?
well, and then that's kind of I would say what they want to avoid, because most people do that. They throw in an empty div so that they can place it, so they can style that container.
Right.
But technically under the hood we kind of have boxes there already, so maybe we can just style those. I would say it's a very exciting space, but I just feel like when I look at CSS when I first joined Microsoft Edge and I look at it now, we are in such a remarkable position.
How long ago was that? Did you join?
It's roughly 4.5 years ago.
Okay.
But I mean, you think about it. When I first joined, the first feature that I worked on was upgrading our implementation from MS Flexbox to the actual current standardized Flex, which is a huge difference. And then Grid, we got updated. Responsive images. There's just so many things that
I'm a big fan of responsive images, and I might be the only person besides Jason Grigsby that's using that.
I don't know. There's a lot of RICG folks that use it, and now that it's kind of in the trunk of like WordPress and other systems, which I actually think is the right way to do it, where people aren't having to really think about it. It's just I upload the image and it takes care of it for me. I think that's the right approach for the responsive images. But I just look at how far front end has come, and I just feel like, yes, there's things that we should go tackle, but I feel like we've made a lot of progress, and I look forward to the progress we make in the next 4 years.
Yeah. So yeah, it's definitely exciting. It gets more exciting all the time. I think the other thing too, I think developers made it too complex. But I don't know that necessarily from the CSS and the layout, enough of them know about that yet. But they made the JavaScript side of it too complex.
Okay.
There's too many tooling, too many layers.
Tooling. So yeah.
Too many steps.
I don't disagree with that. I would say that there are times that it's useful, and I think that there are times where, hey, I just want to play with this little demo. I shouldn't have to np install 700 packages and build.
I was on one project, and every time you changed anything in the JavaScript or anything in the markup, there was a 2-minute node build process that had to go through before you could see it. Yeah. Because there were so many things they wanted to go through. And I'm like,
I think it's one of those things where JavaScript is, I would say, just web development in general is starting to try to learn what C++ developers have had for years. Like, we've had testing, we've had build tools, we've had all those other things. So it's not like this is new. It's just more of how do you make it so it's useful. It's not just getting in the way. And I mean, I went through that same phase. Every single website I built had to have a CMS, and it's like, no, not every website needs a CMS. Right. And so, like my own personal site, it's just static. Yeah. And I just basically
I'm a huge fan of static websites.
The only thing that I actually have, I do have a build step too for you here, but I basically run DocPad, which I learned from a colleague here, which is basically I can write it in Markdown.
Yes.
And then it just converts it over to HTML, and that's it.
That's essentially my work.
But because I just I don't need all these dynamic things popping in, and it slows everything down, and I don't change my site enough. And so I just think that's something that web developers are learning, and I think we're starting to see it, because I mean, you basically had Angular, and then React came in and said, hey, we can do it a little bit better. And then you had Preact that said, hey, we can do the majority of what you have, but faster and lighter. And then, by the way, now we have Vue. But I think that it's evolving. and I think that's okay. I think that's one of the good things about web development is that we do have such competition that we end up with a really good competition. Yes, we end up with I think some pretty decent products to develop in. And the great thing is you don't have to use them.
And I don't.
Yeah, no, exactly. And that's I think one of the great things. You don't have to compile. So
yeah. So well, Greg, I really appreciate your time.
Yeah.
And thanks for sharing with everybody.
As always,
this has been useful. And
I hope it's been useful for all the folks that
watch it. CSS I think is a lot misunderstood and a lot overlooked by the vast majority of developers, especially the ones I tend to interact with at user groups and conferences and stuff like that. Yeah. But I'll be quite honest, I think I spend the majority of my time tweaking, what I call it pushing pixels with CSS to, especially with now that we go to responsive, I think there's a lot of more to that matrix of.
Let me ask you a question then, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Are you okay? Yeah. Okay. So how do you test all of your different browsers?
I use the Chrome responsive thing. Okay. And I just sit there and go through it. And I also have a small device lab that I've accrued. Yeah. And I deploy it up to the server and pull it up on those. And what does it actually feel like? Because I think it's important to actually have a device and see what that's going to be like. Because most developers, you see too many developers, I think, actually on, say, MacBooks that don't have touch on them. Yeah. And so then they deploy it, and it doesn't really work well with touch, right? Yeah. And it's hard to debug on phones. There's just no insight into that, in my opinion. There was better insight back in 2010 than I can get now. Like Winery or whatever helped me. And I know, what Manifold, y'all had the other tool that allowed you to get into it. Manifold's now PWA Builder.
You're asking the wrong person. This is a great question for Karupa or Krill.
Well, Greg, I think Greg Toohey or whatever built it. Okay. Yeah, it was 4 summits ago that y'all launched it over here. I can't remember what it was. But
okay, I feel like a terrible Microsoft.
It was like a new version of Winery. So, okay. But I haven't actually seen.
I'll take your word for it.
So, but I would love to have developer tools easily integrated into the phones. And I know there's a way to do it with Android and Chrome, but to do iOS, you have to go out and buy a MacBook or whatever. And I hate spending money on Apple products.
I won't comment on that part. But I will say I've seen Visual Studio Code do a lot of work, and I have done remote debugging on some of the Windows mobile hardware. In the past.
But y'all always could. It was really hard for not Microsoft people to do that.
Okay.
So they didn't like to open it up to us.
Okay. So
we could do the emulator, which was terrible, but I don't like emulators in general. The Android emulators that I've worked with have always been terrible too.
I definitely agree with actually having a few physical devices. There are just so many Androids, it's impossible to have all of them.
I don't think you have to have all of them.
Just a few, yeah.
Yeah, I've got a very old crappy one that I probably haven't turned on in a year, to be honest with you. But I've got a Samsung 3, and I've got another one that's a little lower powered Samsung, and then I've got my own Pixel 2. Yeah. But I've also got a Nexus 7. I've got another tablet that I've had for 6 years now. And so I've got I've accrued probably 15 devices I could potentially just run a physical game on. So that's another one, because not the Chrome responsive design tool, I would say gets me pretty close to making the hole in the green, right? Yeah. But getting those devices out and actually testing it, and I'll also ask people to pull up on your phone if I see they have a different phone, because I still got an iPhone 4, so I haven't bought one of the newer ones. So, I've got friends that have some of their ones. I'm like, can you bring that up for me? And
Yeah.
what I used to do like 6 or 7 years ago, I would go down the street to the Best Buy and play on their phones.
Don't give your secrets away. They won't let you in.
I haven't done that in a long time now.
Okay.
So, but that was like in the early days. I only had one phone at the time.
Yeah.
And I was racing to build a product. We were trying to launch a new service. And it was my first, it was really the first single page app I did. And we launched with like 400 pages in the site. And I wanted to go see how's it load on this device and this device, because they kept telling me they were going to buy me the devices, and it kept dragging on. I needed to get the work done.
Yeah.
So I'd run down there at lunch and go.
Oh goodness gracious! Like I'm getting stressed out, and I didn't even have to build it.
It was a lot of fun, but I built the SPA infrastructure for that way before any of what I call the fast food frameworks were ever thought of.
Oh, sure.
There was no term single page app. I just said this is how it has to be done, because I was under mandate, do a web app that looks like a native app.
Gotcha.
And I figured it out. I learned I had to dump jQuery, which killed me at the time.
Yeah. Because
jQuery just loads so slow, especially over 3G.
Yeah.
And even Ray Bango at the time was on the jQuery Foundation.
Yeah.
I actually had lunch with him at the time. He said that at that point iPhone wouldn't even cache it using browser cache, because they cut everything off at 25 kilobytes. Anything above that was not cached in browser cache. And it was, I think, 29 or 30 kilobytes compressed. And he's like, we just have all kinds of performance issues because of this stuff. And the CPUs were, as far as the JavaScript engines just couldn't do it. Yeah. And that's not as bad as it was, but it still is an issue that I don't think developers appreciate.
Yeah.
I know the Chrome guys a couple of years ago did a demo where they put a phone on dry ice to get the overclocking of the phone so it would go faster. So.
Oh goodness.
So.
But
yeah.
No, yeah, I think there's the phones. Yeah. I agree. You have to kind of touch them, feel them, and actually like, is that truly responsive? Like, is it responding to my gesture?
Well, but the layouts may not necessarily be represented by the. Y'all also have a little bit of the responsive in the developer tools.
Yeah.
But it hasn't. I don't think it's necessarily been maintained as a first class thing over the years.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, did you even know it was in the developer tools?
So I did, yeah. I think that's a better discussion to have with Jacob Rossi, who works on our dev tools. Because I can't really speak to.
Well, no, I know Andy's team put it in when Andy was in charge of the whole deal. But it was like one of those things that I know they threw it in there, but then they got sidetracked on other important things. Yeah. And it just never really got the love it really deserved.
Sure.
So.
It happens.
Yeah, exactly. So, but those kind of things are super helpful when I'm actually what I call pushing the pixels.
Yeah. When you're doing your initial work, it makes a ton of sense. I'll give away the keys, but I wouldn't mind just having a multi-up, where you can have just multiple windows. Mm-hmm. Where you can have your 1024 and then just have 3 or 4 others of different variants within the single viewport, I guess is my point.
Especially if I can make a whole wall of monitors to have them all there.
well, but I guess that's kind of what I was trying to avoid, is you don't necessarily want 4 Microsoft Edges or Chromes for that matter open. You just want that one viewport split up into multiples, because then you could have your live refresh on that single file. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I think that would be beneficial.
There's something else I started playing with in the last few weeks that I'm kind of regretting I didn't, because I've been wanting this for a long time. I didn't even dawn on me to do it. Was in Chrome you can do the workspace where you can actually make it live editing on the file system. So basically the Chrome dev tools are now my editor.
Oh yeah, you're right.
I didn't realize it was as good as it was, because I was changing colors or sizes or whatever, and it was immediately being reflected right there. Yeah. That was so valuable.
And I know VS Code uses that same whatever.
It can, and I haven't wired that up yet.
Yeah. So that you can just see it live happening. Mm-hmm. They've done a remarkable job.
The tooling that the ASP.NET team came out with 5 or 6 years ago through using WebSockets, I've never really liked, because it threw jQuery in there. And it would step on some things at times, and especially since it was the wrong version of jQuery from what I would use or didn't want jQuery in there. I would because I wrote my own little jQuery library called $Bill. It was 12 kilobytes, and it would step on that, and I would get bugs that I didn't realize were bugs until I until I wasn't using it and stuff. So I stopped using it because they wrote that dependency in there.
Yeah.
And I don't like that, but yeah. So.
Yeah, assumptions are bad.
Yeah, exactly. But it was running in the same. It was essentially running in the same space, the same global space. So it was stepping on what I had.
Yeah.
So yeah, and that's just a general bad practice, is having multiple versions of the same library, which you see a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it happens a ton, especially like on WordPress sites where people include other plugins and those come bundled with jQuery.
Right. Well, I see it in ASP.NET sites because the master and child page scenario, where you have one developer who's working on the nested page and he drops all the JavaScript references in it, but the master page also has them.
Yeah.
And he's been working on them independently. Yeah.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, it's pretty, can get pretty bad.
Yeah. So, well, I really appreciate your time.
Oh, Dan, my pleasure.
Yeah. And hopefully this is useful for everybody.
Hopefully, yeah.
So,
I enjoyed it.
Good deal. So I'm going to try to be interviewing some of these guys a little more frequently over the next few months. And if you got questions, just let me know.
Yeah.
And,
I don't know if you are or not. Are you on Twitter?
I've got 54,000 tweets. I was on day 7 of Twitter.
There you go. So yeah, I'm on Twitter as well at Greg Whitworth. Mm-hmm. Hit me up if you have any questions or want things fixed.
And the Edge Dev Twitter handle is a great way to communicate.
Yes, hit that up as well.
And people don't realize that these guys really want feedback. They've got multiple feedback channels right from Edge. They got the user voice account.
Yeah.
The MS Edge Dev. Occasionally I'll do an Ask Me Anything on Reddit or something like that.
Yeah. We keep that one a little bit.
It's been a while. But
we don't do that one as often because it comes with as many comments as you can imagine.
Yeah.
We haven't done a YouTube comment, Ask Me Anything yet. We should do that sometime.
Yeah.
I'm joking.
No.
I'm joking. But yes, please send us your feedback. We definitely highly value it.
Well, there you go, folks. Straight from the heart of Redmond. And thanks a lot. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. Bye.
All right.